When I returned home, I was shocked. My fence, the one that separated my land from Karen's HOA, was gone. In its place, her garden had doubled in size, as if my property was a free extension of her yard. But before I could process the audacity, I realized something else. My goats, unleashed, in her new garden, chewing on every flower, bush, and expensive plant she had planted. There are things you expect to find when you come back from a trip. Accumulated mail, maybe a nosy neighbor asking if it was fun, or even that weird smell inside the fridge because you forgot to take out the trash before you left. What don't you expect? Finding your fence missing, as if it had been sucked into another dimension, and your neighbor's yard having swallowed up half your property like a real estate cancer. But that's not even the worst of it. In the middle of that new botanical paradise that had sprouted up on my land, my goats were loose, chewing without the slightest consideration any and all signs of plant life that the woman had planted. They ate with gusto, as if it were a luxury buffet. Imported roses? Think of a cow chewing gum. Expensive ornamental shrubs, crushed up like snacks. Small lemon trees? Well, now they were just desolate little trunks. And in the middle of it all, there she was, dressed in gardening clothes, her gloves still dirty with dirt, standing on the devastated lawn with an expression of absolute horror. She looked as if she had just witnessed a mass murder. Her messy hair showed her inner chaos, and her glassy eyes ran from side to side, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "No!" she screamed, throwing the shovel to the ground. I stood there on the doorstep with my arms crossed, admiring the spectacle. There was something almost comical about the scene. My goats, those furry little rascals, completely unaware of the tragedy they were causing, just followed their instinct to devour anything remotely edible. It was a green apocalypse, and they were the hungry zombies. Only then did I realize that the fence hadn't simply disappeared. As I got closer, I saw the remains of it lying in the corner of my yard, like a pile of useless wood. The woman had torn it all down, not to fix it, not out of necessity, but because she had simply decided that my space was now part of her dream landscaping. The problem? She didn't count on my animals, who were used to staying in that space, not understanding that they had been evicted without warning. Life went on as normal for them. Only, instead of an ordinary pasture, they now had access to a decorative magazine garden. And so the outbreak began. The woman ran around trying to save what she could, waving her arms like a human scarecrow. She picked up potted plants and lifted them high in the air, as if my goats were magical and couldn't reach things raised above their heads. A pathetic illusion. Should I have interrupted? I probably should have. But I stood there for a while longer, just watching, taking an almost poetic pleasure in seeing the woman despair in the face of the chaos she herself had created. It was like watching someone build a sandcastle at high tide, and then crash when the water washed it all away. And the best part? The goats didn't even hurry. They chewed slowly, as if they were savoring the destruction. Then she finally noticed me. She stopped in the middle of the wreckage, her eyes wide, her face red with anger. "This is absurd!" she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Of course it is. Absurd! Let's analyze it. She tore down my fence. She turned my property into an extension of her yard without asking permission. And now I was shocked that the legitimate inhabitants of the space were using it? All I could do was laugh through my nose, crossing my arms. Do you really want to have this conversation now? She opened and closed her mouth a few times, like a fish out of water, trying to formulate some crazy justification, but there wasn't much to argue about. She knew she was wrong. I knew she was wrong. Even the goats probably knew. The question was, what was she going to do now? Stay tuned, because this story was far from over. I wanted to say that the woman lost it and realized how stupid she had been. But of course, that's not what happened. People like her don't have that moment of clarity where they admit they've made a mistake and try to put things right. Number they doubled down. So, instead of accepting that it was all her fault, the woman started shouting. First came the classic victim speech, the famous, "You need to control those bugs," as if the problem wasn't the fact that she destroyed my fence and turned my property into a branch of her private botanical garden. Then she started making threats. She said she was going to call the police, that I was going to pay dearly for the damage, that my wild animals couldn't be left to run wild like that. Ah, that part made me laugh. Wild animals. My goats. The terror of the suburbs. The lethal predators that chewed daisies as if they were the main course at a five-star restaurant. I could almost see the news. Group of goats cruelly attacks a defenseless garden in broad daylight. Ridiculous. But I let her talk. Sometimes the best way to win an argument isn't to interrupt. It's to let the person dig their own hole. She talked, she gestured, she pointed, she wailed. Meanwhile, I just watched the destruction in front of me. The ground was covered in chewed leaves, flowers uprooted, broken branches, and in the middle of this battlefield, the goats continued to eat as if nothing was happening. It was only when the woman tried to push one of the goats away that I decided to move. She took a step forward and stretched out her arms, trying to push away one of the bigger ones, which happened to be the most stubborn. Bad idea. Anyone who knows goats knows that they don't like being pushed around very much. This one in particular liked it even less. Before the woman could react, she was head-butted right in the stomach and staggered backwards with an outraged scream. I didn't laugh. Well, maybe I laughed a little, but only on the inside. She held onto her legs, trying to catch her breath, while looking at the goat as if it were a monster. And that's when she finally understood that she wasn't going to be able to deal with this on her own. Without saying another word, she turned on her heels and marched off in the direction of her house. I already knew what was going to happen next. She was going to call for reinforcements. The police, the manager of the housing association, I don't know. Maybe even the president of the country, if she thought it would make a difference. People like that don't solve things through dialogue. They try to put themselves in a position of authority in order to win through intimidation. So instead of worrying, I went to the stable and got a bucket of feed. I gave it a few shakes, and immediately all the goats raised their heads. It's amazing how stubborn and completely deaf they can be when they want to be, but the moment they hear the sound of food, they obey better than any trained dog. I walked slowly back to the part of the yard that was still my real yard, and they followed, munching on the last bits of what used to be expensive plants. Once they were all inside, I closed the makeshift gate I'd made out of some old boards. It wasn't a real fence, but it would keep the goats in place until I sorted out the mess. Just as I finished, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the street. Here came the circus. 2 policemen got out of the vehicle, followed by the woman who was already pointing in my direction as if she was about to witness a war crime. They barely had time to close the doors before she began her speech. "Officers, he let these violent animals loose in my yard and destroyed all my property." I don't know if the policemen were used to this sort of thing, but one of them looked around with the expression of someone wondering why on earth he had accepted this call. The other took a notebook out of his pocket and asked as calmly as he could, "Right, and where exactly was your property?" I didn't even have to open my mouth. The policeman's gaze went straight to the remains of my fence, now lying on the ground, and then back to me. "Was this your fence?" I nodded. He sighed. I felt his soul leaving his body. The woman started babbling again, saying that it wasn't like that her yard was too small, that she needed extra space, and that she was sure the fence had been misplaced for years. But by this point, she was sweating. The policeman wasn't stupid, and from the looks of it, he didn't have the patience to deal with this kind of thing either. He asked a few basic questions, asked if I had proof that the fence had always been there. I did, of course, because, unlike some people, I'm not an impulsive criminal who thinks she can change property laws on the spur of the moment, and then gave one of those polite but completely bored smiles before turning to the woman. "Ma'am, It seems to me that the only thing that happened here was that you knocked down someone else's fence and put your things where they didn't belong. Do you," he looked at me, "want to press charges for trespassing and destruction of property?" The woman froze, I thought, because pressing charges would be fair. It would be right, but it would also mean dealing with it for even longer. So I looked back at the yard, at the ruined garden, at her despair, and I realized that she was already being punished in a way that was far better than any lawsuit could do. So I took a deep breath, looked at the policeman and said, "I think that scene speaks for itself." The policeman shrugged. He didn't seem to care what I decided. He jotted down a few things in his notebook and got ready to leave. But before he closed the notebook, he turned to the woman and issued one last warning. "Next time you want to expand your garden, do it on your own land, or you could end up with a much bigger problem than goats eating your plants." She didn't reply. She just stood there, looking at the disaster around her, while the policemen went back to their car. And what about me? I went to feed the goats. After all, it had been a long day, and they had worked hard. I thought that would be the end of it. That public humiliation and the destruction of her dream garden would be enough to make the woman get over herself and leave me alone. But no, people like that don't learn. They don't take a deep breath, accept defeat, and move on like normal adults. They brood. They plot revenge. Over the next few days, the neighborhood seemed quieter, perhaps because everyone had watched the spectacle from afar and realized that, for the first time, the woman had been caught jumping. The truth was that people were used to her little tyrannies, the absurd rules of the Residents' Association, the ridiculous fines she invented, the senseless complaints about anything that didn't meet the little standard she thought was acceptable. Only this time, it didn't work out for her. This time, everyone saw that the great neighborhood inspector had screwed up and gotten the worst of it. But the peace was short-lived. On the first morning without shouting in my yard, I was on the porch drinking coffee when I saw a truck pull up in front of my house. A man got out, pulling a tape measure and holding a clipboard. Technician of something. He looked at the address and then at my property, frowning as if something wasn't right. I got up and walked over. "Right?" I asked, already suspicious. "I came here to measure your property for the reinstallation of the fence," he said, looking down at his clipboard. Oh, so she'd ordered a new fence. Finally, a glimmer of sense? But then the guy continued. "It seems that the request was made to adjust the correct boundaries of the plot. The old fence was reportedly encroaching on part of the neighboring plot." Oh, that bastard. I crossed my arms, trying to keep calm. "Can I see this application?" The guy hesitated, but showed it to me. And there it was, in black and white. The biggest cock-up ever recorded in the history of bureaucracy. A formal request to reinstall the fence, moved onto my property, reducing my land, with the woman's signature, as if she had any authority to decide where my plot ends and hers begins. I couldn't hold back a laugh. The technician looked at me a little nervously, perhaps thinking I was laughing out of desperation, but I was only impressed by the sheer size of the audacity. It wasn't enough to destroy my fence, expand her yard, and turn my land into a feast for the goats. Now she wanted to legalize the theft. "All right, then. Listen," I said, pointing at the old fence, or rather what was left of it. "That fence had been in the same place for years. I have documents proving where the boundaries of my property are, and, in case you hadn't noticed, that woman there doesn't own any of it." The technician scratched his head. "Well, I just take measurements, sir. But if there's a dispute over the property, you may need an official survey from the town hall." Good. That's exactly what she wanted. That's exactly what she wanted. To drag me through a boring, costly, and bureaucratic process to try and wear down my patience until I gave in. I thanked the technician and returned home, already picking up the land ownership documents. If she wanted war, she was going to get it. And she really wanted it. Over the next few days, a campaign began against me. First, there were formal complaints about the stench coming from my goats. Then came notices about excessive noise, which was curious, since the loudest sound coming from my yard was the occasional bleat of an animal wanting food. Then came the letters from the neighborhood association, all written in that classic passive-aggressive tone, informing me that my property was out of line with community standards. It was hilarious, because I lived there before her. I didn't move into a neighborhood full of annoying little rules. The neighborhood became like that after she arrived, along with that bunch of neighbors who think they can run other people's lives. The last straw was when I received a summons to attend an extraordinary meeting of the association. The reason? To discuss the appropriate use of community spaces. Oh, how subtle. I went to the meeting just to see how far she would go. And there she was, sitting at the head of the table as if she were some kind of legitimate authority figure, with her pile of papers and that expression of false concern. Her speech was a spectacle of manipulation. She talked about harmony in the community, about the need for accessible green spaces for everyone, and, of course, about how certain areas were not being used in the best possible way. I had to stop myself from laughing. She was basically trying to convince the association that my property should be considered common area because, you see, I wasn't using it properly. A woman next to her even let out a, "That makes sense," nodding her head as if she was listening to a genius plan. That's when I stood up. "That's funny," I said, interrupting the antics. "I didn't know that I had signed a contract donating my land to the neighborhood. In fact, I'm sure that if anyone checked, they'd see that my property is mine, bought and paid for, and that you have nothing to do with it." Silence. The woman pressed her lips together, visibly annoyed that I wasn't playing her game. "We just want what's best for everyone," she retorted. "The best for everyone? Or the best for you? Because, as far as I know, the only person who has turned my backyard into your private garden is you." More silence. I continued, "But all right, if you want to go ahead with it, I'm all for it. I'm already organizing an official survey of the town hall, and when it's proven that my land is mine, I'll sue anyone who keeps spreading this ridiculous idea that they can decide what I do with it." This time, there was no reply. She squeezed the papers between her fingers. The other members of the association looked at each other, and the president, who was clearly only there because he had to be, huffed uncomfortably. "I think we can close the meeting for today," he said. I got up and left without expecting anything else. The problem with people like her is that they never think they'll find someone who will hit back. They're used to shouting until they get what they want. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her, and little did I know that, after that, things would get even worse. After the disastrous association meeting, I had hoped that the woman would back down, that she would accept that she had lost and go and find another victim to torment. But of course, that would have been too easy. People like that don't know how to lose. They only know how to turn every little defeat into a personal crusade against logic and common sense. Over the next few days, I noticed a suspicious pattern. Whenever I went out to work or to sort something out, I found little signs of mysterious interventions on my land. First, someone tried to install a ridiculous banner on the edge of my yard with the words, "Future Community Garden, coming soon." Then I noticed that a few bags of compost had been placed next to the remains of the fence, as if someone was starting a new landscaping project on my piece of land. On the third day, I found a group of ladies in straw hats and gardening gloves spreading out across my lawn, holding shovels and seedlings as if they'd been given permission to turn the whole thing into a public park. The woman was there in the middle, giving instructions with that air of superiority, as if she were the president of the UN. That was the last straw. I went down the steps from the balcony and straight to her. "Have you completely lost your mind, or have you just forgotten what private property means?" She looked at me with an affected little smile, as if she'd been expecting it. "We're just trying to bring more greenery to the neighborhood. I don't see what all the fuss is about." The other women looked at each other uncomfortably. They didn't seem to know they were in stolen territory. "The reason," I said, gritting my teeth, "is that this doesn't belong to the neighborhood. It belongs to me. I don't know what lie you told these people, but they can take their shovels and plant their flowers somewhere else." She crossed her arms, still playing the good girl. "You're being selfish. There's so much space here, and we just want a nice place for everyone." "Oh, I get it. So, if I decide that your house has too much space and would make a great community hall, that's fine with you?" Silence. Of course it wasn't all right, because the problem was never space or the well-being of the neighborhood. The problem was that she wanted to run everything. One of the ladies snorted and put down her shovel, clearly realizing that she had been tricked. Another muttered, "I think I'll be going," before quickly walking away. And one by one, the impromptu helpers began to disperse, until there was just me and the woman in the middle of my devastated lot. She stared at me, still trying to hold her pose, but I could tell she was furious. "You can't fight progress," she said, as if she were lecturing me. "No, but I can fight against trespassing. In fact, I'm already arranging for a new fence, a very high one this time, so there's no risk of anyone accidentally stumbling the wrong way." Her eyes flashed with anger. "It's not over." "Ah, but it was over for me." The next day, I hired a team to install a new fence. Not a flimsy wooden fence like the previous one, but a beautiful reinforced structure, with posts driven so deep into the ground that even an earthquake wouldn't bring them down. While the workers pounded the posts into the ground, the woman watched from her balcony, arms crossed, with an expression that mixed hatred and frustration. When they'd finished, I went over to the fence and tapped my hand on the top, satisfied. "Now, let's see who tries to expand the garden again." I thought that would be the end of the soap opera, but of course, there had to be a bonus episode. That night, I woke up to a strange noise. I went to the window, and under the yellowish light of the street lamps, I saw a furtive shadow near the new fence. It was her. She was dressed in a dark sweatshirt and holding something in her hands, as if she was about to commit an act of pure childishness. I watched as she tried, unsuccessfully, to pull one of the posts out of the fence. After realizing that the structure was more solid than her inflated ego, she tried to push the fence over, snorting like a bull. I had to stop myself from laughing. I took out my cell phone, opened the camera, and started filming. She noticed the glare on the screen and froze in place, slowly turning to face me. I held up my phone. "Do you want to smile for the camera, or would you rather I sent this straight to the police?" She stood still for a few seconds, and then, without saying a word, walked off at a brisk pace back home, her hands stuffed in her pockets. And that, finally, was the end of the saga. Over the next few days, she avoided me. There were no more ridiculous notes, no more false accusations, no more attempts to turn my backyard into Central Park. She still cast deadly glances when we crossed paths in the street, but she never tried to invade my land again. And the goats? Well, they had the best meal of their lives. And, honestly, I don't think they've ever forgiven me for putting up the new fence. But everything has a price. Moral of the story? If you want a beautiful garden, plant it in your own space, or accept the consequences when the goats decide that your flowers are a feast. And don't forget to comment on what you thought of the video, and leave a like to strengthen the channel.